He stopped to help. Now he's the one in handcuffs. When Big Shaq pulled over to help a stranded woman change her tire, he never expected flashing police lights, a false accusation, and a deadly secret that could get them both killed. The officer in charge isn't just corrupt, he's working for someone powerful, someone who makes people disappear. Now, Shaq is trapped in a dangerous game of lies, survival, and power. Can he outsmart the system before it's too late? Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The night was restless. Thick, low-hanging clouds blanketed the sky, the distant hum of thunder rolling over the empty stretch of road. Big Shaq had been driving for hours, his mind locked on business meetings and endless phone calls. But now, as the rain pounded against his windshield in heavy, rhythmic sheets, he finally allowed himself a moment of silence. He was about to pass a narrow pull-off near the tree line when something caught his eye. A lone car, hazard lights flickering weakly. And beside it, a woman, hunched over, struggling to change a flat tire. Shaq exhaled through his nose. This wasn't his problem. Not really. But then he noticed the way she moved. Hurried, frantic. Almost as if she was terrified someone might see her. That's what made him slow down. With a slight turn of the wheel, Shaq pulled onto the shoulder, his headlights illuminating the soaked pavement. As soon as he opened the car door, the cold hit him first. Sharp, biting rain slapped against his skin, soaking through his hoodie within seconds. He ignored it. The woman, early 30s, dark hair plastered to her face, clothes clinging to her frame, stiffened the moment she noticed him. Her hands, smeared with dirt, tightened around the tire iron. Shaq raised both hands in a universal sign of peace. "Hey, I'm not here to bother you. Just figured you could use some help." The woman hesitated, glancing back at her car like it held some kind of answer. Then, reluctantly, she took a small step back. "It's fine, I've got it." She didn't sound fine. Shaq's sharp instincts, honed through years of dealing with people in business and in life, kicked in immediately. He was good at reading people, and right now, she was scared. Still, he kept his posture easy, his movements slow. "It's pouring out here," he said, pulling up his hood. "Let me at least get the last bolts off. Won't take more than a minute." She hesitated again, but this time, she nodded. Shaq crouched, quickly assessing the situation. The tire was half loose, but she had struggled with the last bolt. He grabbed the iron, adjusted his grip, and, with one firm twist, popped it free. That should have been the end of it. But as Shaq reached for the spare, he heard it. A whisper. So faint, he almost thought he imagined it. "You need to leave. Now." Shaq's hands stilled. He turned his head slightly, meeting her eyes. They weren't just afraid, they were pleading, his muscles locked. Every instinct screamed at him. This wasn't just a broken-down car. Before he could speak, flashing red and blue lights exploded behind them. Shaq's stomach dropped. The woman's face turned pale. This wasn't a coincidence. This was a setup. Shaq rose slowly, keeping his hands visible as the rain pelted against his shoulders. The police cruiser rolled to a stop behind them. Its headlights were blinding, turning the wet pavement into a sea of glistening white. The woman took a shaky step back. Shaq didn't move. The driver's side door swung open with a heavy metallic creak, and a uniformed officer stepped out, adjusting his belt. Another followed. The first cop, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a shaved head and a face that looked like it had never cracked a smile, took a long look at Shaq, then at the woman. His gaze lingered on her just a second too long. Then he turned to Shaq, expression unreadable. "You got ID on you?" Shaq's jaw flexed. Not "what's going on?" or "everything all right?" Just straight to ID. Shaq stayed calm, his voice steady. Didn't realize changing a tire required identification. The second officer, a younger man, nervous, glancing between them too often, shifted uncomfortably. The first cop didn't blink. "I'm gonna need you to step away from the car, sir." Shaq clenched his teeth. Sir, not buddy, not man. That word was careful. Too careful. Something was wrong. But the last thing Shaq needed was to escalate. So, slowly, he stepped back. The woman flinched, Her lips parted slightly like she wanted to say something, but before she could, the first officer turned to her. "Vanessa," he said smoothly. "You all right?" Shaq's blood ran cold. He knew her name. Vanessa swallowed, her hands curled into fists. "Yeah," she said. Too quiet, too forced. Shaq watched as the officer took another step forward, blocking her in. It was subtle, a shift in control. And then Shaq understood. They weren't here for him. They were here for her. Shaq needed to think, fast. His eyes flicked to the second officer, the younger one. He wasn't comfortable. That meant he wasn't fully in on this. A weak link. Shaq exhaled, leveling his voice. "So, what exactly am I being asked to step away for?" The older cop, Holloway, turned back to him. His smile didn't reach his eyes. "You match the description of someone we're looking for." Shaq didn't flinch. "That so?" Holloway shrugged. "Big guy, hoodie, dark SUV. Sound familiar?" Shaq had to force himself to stay calm. That was every third man in this city. This wasn't about him. This was about control. Vanessa looked like she wanted to run. Shaq didn't blame her, because the second Holloway reached for his cuffs, he knew. They weren't letting her go. The realization hit him like a gut punch. Shaq had walked into something dangerous, and now they were making sure he couldn't walk out. "Turn around," Holloway said. "Hands behind your back." Shaq stood dead still. Vanessa let out a shaky breath. "No," she whispered. He didn't do anything. Holloway ignored her. "Now." Shaq could feel the younger cop's hesitation. He could feel Vanessa's fear. And for the first time, he felt something deeper than frustration. He felt the trap close. He had a choice. Push back and risk everything. Or play along and find out the real game. Shaq exhaled. Slowly, deliberately, he turned. Cold metal snapped around his wrists. A final confirmation. This wasn't just a traffic stop. This was a cover-up. And Shaq? He just became part of it. As Holloway tightened the cuffs, he leaned in, voice low. "Wrong place, wrong time, huh?" Shaq didn't respond. His eyes stayed locked on Vanessa, who looked like she might break. Holloway gave a slow, satisfied nod. Then, he opened the back of the squad car. And Shaq understood. He wasn't getting a ride to the station. He was getting buried. Somewhere, someone had decided he needed to disappear. And if he didn't outplay them fast, that's exactly what was going to happen. The night air had turned heavy, thick with the weight of something unseen. The flashing red and blue lights cut through the darkness, bouncing off the wet pavement in sharp, distorted reflections. Shaq's pulse stayed steady, but his mind was moving fast. 2 officers had stepped out of the cruiser. The first one, Holloway, tall, broad, and moving with the kind of confidence that came from knowing he had power. His uniform looked pressed to perfection, boots polished, his hand resting too comfortably on his belt. Not near his gun, just close enough for intimidation. The second officer, younger, leaner, and already uncomfortable. His eyes darted between Shaq and Vanessa, like he knew something he wasn't supposed to. Holloway stopped a few feet away, tilting his head. "Step away from the vehicle, sir." Shaq didn't move. He didn't flinch. "I was just helping her change a tire." His voice was even, measured. Nothing else. Vanessa stayed completely still beside the car. Not breathing. Not blinking. Holloway's smirk deepened. He looked Shaq up and down, like he was making a calculation. "That so?" he asked, slow and deliberate. "Because you match the description of a suspect we're looking for." Shaq's stomach went cold. Vanessa gasped, but it wasn't at Shaq. Her eyes snapped to the younger officer. And that's when Shaq saw it. The hesitation, the quick inhale, the way the younger cop's shoulders tensed like he was caught in something he didn't want to be part of. This wasn't a coincidence. This was planned. But the second cop wasn't fully on board. Shaq had been in a lot of negotiations in his life. Deals where one word too many could cost millions, or worse, cost everything. This question mark. This was the same game. Different players, different stakes, same rules. Holloway was expecting him to push back. He was baiting him. Shaq exhaled slowly, adjusting his stance. Non-threatening, but unshaken. And what suspect would that be? Shaq asked. Holloway's smirk didn't fade, because he didn't have an answer, just like Shaq expected. Big guy, dark SUV. Hoodie, Holloway said, watching Shaq's reaction closely. Sound familiar? Shaq clenched his jaw. That was every third man in this city. This wasn't about a description. This was about justifying whatever they had planned next. His mind flicked back to Vanessa, still shaking, still not saying anything. Why? Because she already knew how this would go. Shaq stole a quick glance at her. She looked frozen in place. Not the kind of fear where you're worried something might happen, the kind where you already know what's coming. Miss, Holloway said, turning to her now. You all right? Vanessa stiffened. Shaq caught the barely noticeable shake of her head. But when she spoke, her voice was small, careful. I'm fine, she said. He was just helping. Holloway smiled like a man who had already decided what the truth was. That right? She nodded. Too fast. Too much fear. Shaq felt his stomach twist. Holloway wasn't asking for her confirmation. He was waiting for her to crack. And if she did, whatever story they had planned would stick. Shaq shifted his focus back to the younger officer. His posture was wrong. Too stiff. Not the way a confident cop stands. The way a man stands when he knows something isn't right. Shaq's voice dropped just slightly. Just enough to keep Holloway from interrupting. You okay, officer? The younger cop snapped his gaze to him, startled. What? You keep looking at her, Shaq said, his tone even. Like you know something she doesn't. Holloway's smirk immediately vanished. That's enough, Holloway snapped. Shaq didn't blink. Didn't realize asking a question was a crime. The young cop swallowed hard. He took a small step back, adjusting his stance. He wasn't fully in control of this situation. Holloway was. And now? Now Holloway was pissed. Holloway exhaled through his nose. Displeased. He gave Shaq a long, deliberate look. Then, he pulled out his cuffs. Turn around, Holloway said. Hands behind your back. Vanessa gasped again. The younger officer flinched. And Shaq? Shaq stayed perfectly still. Because he already knew. This had nothing to do with a suspect. This had nothing to do with the law. This had to do with making him disappear. You can't, Vanessa blurted out suddenly. Too loud, too fast. Holloway turned on her. Instantly. You got something to say? She hesitated, just a split second too long. Enough time for Holloway to turn the threat toward her. Shaq's jaw locked. Because he knew exactly what Holloway was about to do. Shift the target. Make her the problem. Put the pressure on her. You sure you're all right? Holloway asked again. Slow. Dangerous. Vanessa took a half step back. Shaq cut her off. Vanessa. His voice was firm, unshakable. She looked at him, panic in her eyes. Did I hurt you? Shaq asked, keeping his voice deliberate. Controlled. She shook her head. No, of course not. Did I threaten you? Another shake. No. Holloway's patience was cracking, because his plan was falling apart. Holloway's grip on the cuffs tightened. His eyes flashed, but Shaq wasn't done. Officer, Shaq said, turning back to the young cop, the weak link. Do I look like the suspect you're searching for? Silence. The young officer shifted again. Then, finally, no. Holloway's whole body went rigid. That was the first crack in his control. Shaq saw it, Vanessa saw it, and Holloway knew it. That was the moment everything changed. The rain pounded harder. The air between them felt thick, like it might snap. Holloway licked his lips, adjusting his stance. Then, he took a step closer to Shaq, voice low, dangerous. You think you're smart? He muttered. Shaq didn't move, didn't flinch. You think someone's gonna come save you? The unspoken threat hung heavy in the air. And Shaq? He just smiled. Because Holloway had already lost. The sharp click of the handcuffs echoed louder than it should have. Shaq barely had time to process it before the cold metal tightened around his wrists, locking in place. His jaw clenched, not in fear, Not in shock, in calculation. He had walked into a game that had already started without him. And now, he was their next move. No! Vanessa's voice sliced through the rain. Her panic was instant, genuine. He didn't do anything, she shouted, stepping forward. But Holloway? He didn't even look at her. He just yanked Shaq toward the squad car with a grip meant to prove a point, meant to establish dominance. You have the right to remain silent, Holloway began, his tone smooth, practiced, like he had been waiting for this moment. Shaq exhaled slowly, steadying himself. Not because he was afraid, not because he didn't see this coming, but because now he knew exactly what this was. This wasn't about him. This was about Vanessa, and they needed him out of the way. The younger officer stood frozen, his expression caught somewhere between discomfort and regret. Shaq caught it. The micro-movements, the guilt. The kid knew something. Shaq turned his head just slightly, locking eyes with him. You know this is wrong, Shaq said, voice low. The young officer flinched. Holloway yanked harder on Shaq's arm, forcing him a step closer to the squad car. Keep your mouth shut, Holloway snapped. Shaq's muscles flexed. He could have resisted, could have made this a fight. But that's what Holloway wanted. He was trying to build a case before there was one, trying to make Shaq the problem. So instead, Shaq let himself be moved, not because he was powerless, but because power wasn't always about fighting. Sometimes it was about waiting for the right moment to strike. Vanessa stepped forward, shaking her head in disbelief. This is insane, she said, her voice breaking. You can't just arrest him. Holloway still didn't look at her, didn't acknowledge her at all, because she wasn't the point right now. Shaq was. Holloway smirked. He matches a description, lady. That's enough for me. Vanessa's breathing hitched. Shaq saw it. The way her hands curled into fists, the way her eyes flicked between the officers like she was piecing something together. And then, it hit her. Her face paled. You knew, she whispered. The second officer stiffened. Shaq's blood ran cold. Knew what? Shaq asked, voice even. Vanessa swallowed hard. Her next words changed everything. This isn't about you, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. It's about me. The air shifted. Shaq saw it now, the full picture. This wasn't random. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a message. Shaq had stepped into something far bigger than a stranded woman on the side of the road. He was never the main target. He was just the obstacle. And Holloway? Holloway was making sure that obstacle was removed. Shaq had two options. First, resistance force Holloway to show his hand. But that would give them exactly what they wanted. A reason to escalate. Second, play along. Let the game continue. Because the real fight wasn't here. Shaq chose option 2. All right, he said, nodding once. Holloway faltered, just for a second. Because he expected pushback. Not control. Shaq turned his head, looking at Vanessa. You good? She blinked, confused. What? You good? He repeated. She hesitated. Then slowly, she nodded. Shaq smirked. Then I'm good. Holloway gritted his teeth. He knew exactly what Shaq was doing, and it pissed him off. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, but the tension, that wasn't fading. Shaq stood beside the squad car, wrists cuffed, but his posture was perfect, unshaken. Holloway leaned in. Too close. You think you're smart? Holloway murmured. Shaq smiled. I don't think. I know. Holloway's smirk returned, and that's when he dropped the bomb. Oh yeah? Holloway said. Then you'll love this part. He turned to Vanessa. You're coming with us too. Shaq's expression finally shifted. Because that? That wasn't part of the plan. Vanessa's eyes widened in horror. No, wait. The younger cop moved forward, hesitating. Sarge, we don't have cause. She interfered with an arrest, Holloway cut in. That's enough for me. Shaq clenched his jaw. Now the game had changed. Because now, she was trapped with him. And whatever Holloway had planned next, they were about to find out. Together. The backseat of the police cruiser smelled like damp leather and stale sweat, the air thick with something heavier than just the rain beating against the windshield. The distant hum of passing cars barely registered over the silence inside, a silence so dense it felt like a living thing, stretching and pressing down on every breath. Shaq had been in tense situations before, but this was different. This wasn't just about him. This was a game of survival, and the rules had already been written in blood long before he stepped into it. Vanessa sat beside him, hands cuffed, fingers trembling against her lap. Her shoulders rose and fell in uneven breaths, her whole body coiled tight like she was waiting for the walls to close in. She had been fighting to keep her composure, but Shaq could feel the cracks forming, the weight of whatever secret she was carrying pressing down on her like an anvil. He didn't know what she had done or why she was running, but one thing was clear. She wasn't the criminal here. Up front, the younger officer sat rigid, his hands locked onto the wheel like it was the only thing keeping him grounded. He hadn't spoken since they got in the car, and that silence said more than words ever could. Shaq could see it in the way his knuckles had gone white, in the way he refused to look back. Because he knew. And Holloway? That smug bastard sat in the driver's seat, completely at ease, tapping his fingers against the wheel like this was nothing more than a slow day on the job. There was something chilling about the way he carried himself, like a man who had already won. "You know this isn't right." Vanessa's voice was quiet, but the weight behind it was enough to make the rookie flinch. She wasn't talking to Holloway. She was talking to the kid. Shaq watched as the young cop finally turned his head just slightly, his jaw clenched so tight it looked like it might crack. His eyes flickered toward Vanessa, and for the first time since the arrest, Shaq saw something real in them. Hesitation. Holloway noticed it too. The tapping stopped, and just like that, the entire dynamic shifted. The air inside the cruiser turned thick, the kind of suffocating stillness that only came before something explosive. And then, Vanessa cracked. She exhaled sharply, her restraint snapping in half as the words tore out of her mouth. "He's working for Donovan Price." Shaq felt it the moment it landed. It was like dropping a lit match into gasoline. Holloway didn't even try to hide it. His whole demeanor changed. His fingers twitched toward his holster. And that's when Shaq knew. This wasn't an accusation. It was a death sentence. Donovan Price. The name slithered through the air like a curse, like something that shouldn't be spoken aloud. Shaq had heard that name before. It lived in the dark corners of whispered conversations, in the underbelly of power where men like Price thrived. A businessman, a politician, a ghost, a man who could make people disappear. And now? Now Shaq knew exactly what this was. Vanessa wasn't just some stranded woman with bad luck. She was running from something big. And Holloway? Holloway was making sure she didn't get away. The car was silent again, but this time it wasn't just tension. It was a ticking bomb. Holloway let the name settle, rolling it over in his head, weighing his options. And then, slowly, his hand drifted back to his holster. He wasn't thinking about arresting anyone. He was thinking about cleaning up a mess. Shaq felt Vanessa stiffen beside him, felt the way the rookie's breath hitched in his throat. The kid was smart enough to realize what was about to happen. But was he smart enough to stop it? Shaq wasn't about to find out. Not yet. He leaned forward slightly, just enough for his voice to slip through the cracks in the silence. "You're not just some cop, are you?" Holloway's cold blue eyes flicked toward him. Shaq tilted his head, studying him like a man who had already solved the puzzle. "You're a fixer." Holloway didn't respond, didn't blink, but his grip on the gun tightened. Shaq kept going. "Donovan Price doesn't pay you to serve. He pays you to clean up his messes." The rookie flinched. Vanessa sucked in a breath. And Holloway? For the first time, he hesitated. It wasn't much, barely a second. But Shaq had played enough power games in his life to know what hesitation meant. It meant doubt. And doubt? That was an opening. Shaq leaned in just a fraction more, lowering his voice so only Holloway could hear. "And I just texted my lawyer everything. A lie. A bluff. But a damn good one." Because Holloway froze. The smirk slipped just slightly, just enough for Shaq to know he'd hit something. Holloway wasn't worried about Vanessa. He wasn't even worried about Shaq. He was worried about being exposed. Men like Donovan Price thrived in the shadows, but the moment the light hit them, they crumbled. Holloway knew it. And now, he was reevaluating everything. Shaq didn't let up. "You think you have control here," he murmured. "But you don't, because I just made you a liability." Holloway's jaw ticked. For the first time, he looked at the rookie, looked at Vanessa, looked at Shaq, and he realized the numbers weren't in his favor anymore. 3 against 1. And then, sirens. Louder, closer. And just like that, the entire house of cards collapsed. The road flooded with flashing red and blue lights, squad cars screeching to a halt. Doors slammed, commands were shouted, and Holloway knew. He had lost. Shaq watched as his entire body went stiff, his fingers still twitching against the gun, like he was still considering making a move. But Shaq saw it. The shift, the flicker of doubt, the understanding that he wasn't the one pulling the strings anymore. Slowly, deliberately, he raised his hands, surrendering. For now. The officers moved in fast, cuffs, barked orders, Holloway being dragged away. And just like that, it was over. Or at least this part was. Because Shaq knew one thing for sure. Holloway wasn't the real problem. Donovan Price was. And this was just a warning shot. The police cruiser was silent, but Shaq felt the war raging inside it. On one side, Sergeant Holloway, a man who didn't flinch at bending the law, who probably hadn't written a real police report in years. On the other, a rookie officer, young, nervous, still deciding which side of the line he stood on. And in the middle, Shaq and Vanessa, the only 2 people who weren't supposed to leave this car alive. Shaq had been in tense negotiations before, multi-million-dollar deals where one wrong sentence could cost him everything. But this was a different kind of game. Life and death. And he needed to win. Shaq leaned forward, his voice steady, measured. "You're not just some cop, Holloway. You're a fixer." The sergeant's smirk flickered, a small reaction, barely noticeable. But Shaq caught it. He pressed harder. "Donovan Price pays you to clean things up, to make people disappear." Beside him, Vanessa sucked in a sharp breath. Holloway's smirk returned, but it wasn't as confident. "You watch too many movies," he said. But Shaq saw it, the tension in his shoulders. The rookie wasn't breathing. His fingers twitched against the radio. He knew. He had probably known for a while. And now, he was stuck in it. Shaq locked eyes with Holloway in the rearview mirror and dropped the bomb. "And I just texted my lawyer everything." A beat of silence. Then, Holloway's fingers froze mid-tap against the steering wheel. Shaq could almost hear the gears grinding in his head. If Shaq had really sent that message, Holloway was compromised. A paper trail, evidence. Price wouldn't protect him if he got sloppy. Holloway's smirk was gone now. Shaq had seen that look before, on powerful men who realized they weren't untouchable. And then, sirens. The sound pierced through the night. Faint, but getting closer. Vanessa's breath hitched. The rookie's head snapped toward Holloway. Shaq leaned back, giving Holloway a slow, knowing look. "You were about to make me disappear." A pause. "Looks like I beat you to it." Holloway's grip on the wheel tightened. His next move would decide everything. Does he risk it, or does he cut his losses? Shaq's mind raced. He had seconds. If Holloway doubled down, he might drive them somewhere off-grid. If the sirens weren't for them, no one would know where they went. But if Holloway panicked? If he thought his boss wouldn't back him up? Shaq saw it in real time. The second doubt crept in. Holloway's fingers twitched away from his gun. His jaw clenched. The sirens got closer. And then, he made his move. Holloway suddenly threw the car into park. Vanessa flinched. The rookie's hand went to his belt, but Holloway wasn't reaching for his gun. Instead, he twisted toward the back seat, his face dark with rage. "You have no idea what you just did." Shaq didn't blink. "Neither do you." Holloway's chest rose and fell. He was calculating, measuring the fallout. But Shaq had already taken the power from him. Because now Now, he wasn't the one making the decisions anymore. The sirens were too close. And Holloway knew it. The radio crackled. "Dispatch to Unit 4. What's your status?" The rookie stared at the radio like it was a live grenade. Shaq saw the moment his soul cracked. The kid wasn't a bad cop. He was just scared. But now he had to pick a side. Slowly, the rookie reached for his radio. Holloway's jaw clenched. Shaq braced himself. And then, the rookie pressed the button. "Unit 4 here. We need backup." Silence. Holloway's face went blank. Shaq had seen that look before. The exact moment when a man realizes he's lost. Holloway's fingers twitched. One last attempt to grab control. But the sirens were already here. Headlights flashed through the windows. Multiple cop cars skidded to a stop around them. Doors flew open, guns drawn, voices shouting. Holloway slowly raised his hands. The rookie? He let out a shaky breath and stepped out of the car first. Shaq felt Vanessa tremble beside him. It was over, or at least this part was, because now the real war was about to begin. The storm raged around them, pounding against the windshield of the police cruiser. Shaq's reflection in the rain-slicked glass looked back at him, calm, collected, but inside his mind was a battlefield. Every muscle in his body was taut, his instincts razor-sharp. He had been in pressure cooker situations before, high-stakes negotiations, boardroom power struggles where billions of dollars were on the line. But this was different. This wasn't about money. This was about survival. Vanessa sat beside him, her breathing uneven. She wasn't just scared. She was calculating, trying to figure out her next move. Outside the car, Sergeant Holloway stood still, one hand dangerously close to his belt. His expression was unreadable, but Shaq could sense it, the barely contained rage simmering beneath the surface. On the other side of the line, the rookie, a young officer, barely past his probationary period. The kid was shaking, his eyes darting between Holloway, Shaq, and the flashing lights approaching from the distance. This was the moment. A single second, a single choice could change the course of their lives forever. The rookie shifted on his feet, his fingers twitching near his holster, not drawing, not backing away. He was frozen between duty and fear. Shaq recognized that look, the look of a man standing at the edge of a cliff, deciding whether to jump. And then, he made his decision. Slowly, carefully, he stepped between Holloway and Vanessa. His voice was uneven, but there was steel beneath it. "Sergeant, we're not taking them in." The words hung in the air like a gunshot. Holloway's lips curled, his fingers twitching dangerously close to his gun. Then, he laughed. A cold, humorless chuckle, shaking his head like the rookie was a naive child. "You sure about that?" Holloway's voice was low, dangerous. It wasn't a question. It was a threat. Shaq felt Vanessa tense beside him. He could almost hear her heart pounding. The rookie swallowed hard, but he didn't back down. "Yes, sir." Holloway's jaw tightened. His fingers curled into fists. His eyes burned with fury. This wasn't about arresting a suspect anymore. This was about power, and Holloway wasn't used to losing. Shaq knew he had seconds before this exploded, so he did what he did best. He took control of the room. Shaq leaned forward, his deep voice cutting through the tension. "You already lost, Holloway." The sergeant's cold blue eyes snapped toward him. Shaq didn't blink, didn't flinch. "You know how this works." He kept his tone calm, even, unshakable. "The moment cops start turning on each other, it's over." Holloway's lip curled. But Shaq wasn't finished. "You've been getting away with this for years, because you controlled the narrative." He nodded toward the rookie. "But that's gone now. Because he's not playing by your rules anymore." A dangerous silence settled over them. Holloway's fingers twitched again, still too close to his weapon. One wrong move and this could spiral. Shaq stayed perfectly still, waiting, watching, calculating. And then, the sirens changed everything. Bright headlights flooded the road. More squad cars, doors slamming, radios crackling. A new voice cut through the chaos like a blade. "Stand down." For the first time, Shaq saw it. Holloway's confidence wavered. A flicker of doubt. A shift in his stance. This wasn't going his way. His grip loosened. His shoulders dropped. And finally, he obeyed. A high-ranking officer, Lieutenant Harris, stepped forward, his gaze sharp. "Sergeant Holloway, step away from the vehicle." Holloway didn't move at first. Shaq saw it. The final war raging inside him. Fight or surrender. A final calculation. Then, with a slow, controlled motion, Holloway unclipped his belt and raised his hands. Surrendering, for now. The officers moved in fast, cuffs clicking, commands barked, and just like that, Holloway was done. Shaq exhaled. Finally. But the battle wasn't over, because this was just the beginning. Shaq watched as Holloway was loaded into a squad car, his face a mask of barely contained rage. Not fear. Anger. Because Holloway knew something Shaq did too. He wasn't the final boss. Donovan Price was. And this was just a warning shot. Shaq turned to Vanessa. She was still shaking, but her eyes, they were different now. Not just fear, determination. "We have to keep going," she whispered. Shaq nodded. "We will." And as the police lights painted the highway in red and blue, one thought burned in Shaq's mind. Donovan Price thought he was untouchable. But that was about to change. 7. The Fall. A name that meant fear, now means nothing. The wind howled through the empty stretch of road, carrying the distant echo of sirens as Holloway was shoved into the back of a squad car. His blank expression didn't fool Shaq. He wasn't scared. He was calculating. Holloway wasn't the type to crumble under pressure. No, men like him didn't fall apart. They regrouped. Shaq had seen it before, powerful men who thought they were untouchable. When the walls closed in, they didn't panic. They planned. Shaq kept his eyes locked on Holloway's through the squad car window, watching for it. The shift, the flicker of something beneath the surface. There it was. A smirk. Subtle. Almost imperceptible. But Shaq caught it. This isn't over. The young officer stood off to the side, his chest rising and falling rapidly, his face pale under the flickering red and blue lights. His hands trembled slightly at his sides. He had just committed career suicide, defying Holloway, standing against him, choosing the right side instead of the easy one. Shaq knew that look, the weight of a choice that couldn't be undone. Finally, the rookie exhaled and met Shaq's gaze. "You saved her." Shaq held his stare, shaking his head. I just didn't look away. That was the difference. That's what separated people like him from people like Holloway. Holloway counted on silence. Donovan Price counted on fear. But tonight, that fear cracked. And cracks, if pushed hard enough, become breaks. Vanessa stood a few feet away, arms wrapped tightly around herself. She was safe. For now. But Shaq knew safety was temporary when you were tangled with men like Donovan Price. The police could only protect her if they chose to. And after what Holloway had just proven, Shaq wasn't betting on it. Vanessa must have felt it too. Because instead of relief, there was something else in her eyes as she looked at Holloway being driven away. Fury, not the kind that flares up and dies down, the kind that lingers, that grows roots, that waits for the right moment to strike. She turned back to Shaq. "You didn't have to stop," she said, her voice raw. "You could have just kept driving." Shaq exhaled. She wasn't wrong. He hadn't owed her anything. And yet, here they were. Shaq moved toward his car, gripping the door handle. He should leave. This should be over. But his gut told him it wasn't. Because Holloway was just one piece of a bigger machine. And Donovan Price, he still had power. Shaq glanced at Vanessa one last time. She was watching him carefully now. Waiting for something. Waiting for a decision. He tightened his grip on the steering wheel. He had already made it. This wasn't just her fight anymore. It was his. And Donovan Price was about to learn a very painful lesson. When you come for one, you answer to all. This isn't just a story. It's a reality too many people face. Corruption thrives in silence. But tonight, Shaq refused to look the other way. What would you do in his place? If this story gripped you, made you think, or opened your eyes, don't let it end here. Share it. Talk about it. Stand up when it matters. Because the fight against injustice isn't just in dramatic moments, it's in everyday choices. Subscribe, follow, and stay with us for more stories that challenge power, expose corruption, and remind us that doing the right thing isn't always easy, but it's always worth it. Your voice matters. Use it.